My name is Evelyn Porter, and at 38 years old, I finally bought a house that did not come with anyone else's expectations attached to it. It was a pale blue bungalow near Chesapeake Bay, small enough that you could hear the floorboards complain when the wind pushed against the porch, old enough that the windows stuck when the air got damp, and quiet in a way I had forgotten a place could be. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now, while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. For 14 years, I worked as a 911 dispatcher supervisor. I knew how to keep my voice steady while someone else's life fell apart on the other end of the line. I knew how to ask for an address twice, how to listen through panic, how to separate fear from fact. What I did not know, until I stood in that kitchen with 3 boxes still unopened, was how peaceful silence could sound when nobody was calling my name. The deed was still on the counter. One name, mine. I had moved in that Wednesday afternoon, the 17th of September 2025. By 8:12 that night, my phone lit up with my mother's name. I answered because some habits survive longer than they should. "Mom?" She did not say hello. "Your father and I sold the house," she said. "The truck comes tomorrow before noon. Make sure the back bedroom is ready." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. I looked around at my unfinished kitchen, the ivory cabinets, the folded dish towels, the keys lying beside the sink. Ready for what? "For us, Evelyn. Don't start. This is my house," I said carefully. My mother sighed, like I had embarrassed her by stating something obvious. "You're living alone in a whole house. That's selfish. If you don't like how family works, you can rent somewhere else." My hand was shaking, but my eyes had gone back to the deed. And that was when I realized my mother had made her first mistake. Her second mistake was believing I would answer like the daughter she had spent a lifetime training. For most of my life, I would have softened first and understood later. I would have asked how bad things were, whether Dad was all right, whether Owen knew, whether there was something I could do before I ever asked what had already been taken from me. I would have made my own shock quiet enough for my mother to step over. But that night, standing in my half-unpacked kitchen with the bay wind pressing against the windows, I heard myself say, "I'll call you back." Then I ended the call before she could give me another instruction. For a while, I did nothing. The refrigerator hummed. A cardboard box leaned open beside the table with plates wrapped in newspaper. Outside, the marsh grass moved in the dark, soft and steady, like the house itself was breathing for me until I remembered how. My phone sat face down on the counter, and every old reflex in my body wanted to pick it up, fix it, smooth it over, make the problem smaller by making myself smaller. But I had spent 14 years taking emergency calls, and the first rule of a bad scene is not to run toward the loudest voice. You check what is real. You find the facts. You look for the thing that will make everything worse if you miss it. The full shape of it would come to me in pieces later that night. One call and one message at a time, but by morning I knew enough. I knew my parents' house had not simply sold in some sudden panic. It had been listed, negotiated, and put under contract while I was still choosing where to put my coffee mugs. I knew Owen had been speaking about my spare room, as if it were already waiting for him. I knew my father had signed papers because Stanley Porter had spent most of his marriage signing whatever my mother slid in front of him, and I knew the one fact that mattered most. No one had ever asked me. At 11:55 the next morning, the moving truck turned onto my gravel drive, too big for the lane and too certain of its welcome. My mother stepped down first, dressed like she was arriving at a family luncheon. My father came after her, pale and careful, looking anywhere but at my front door. Owen jumped out of the cab and went straight for the back of the truck. But the porch was not empty. Aunt Claudia stood there, with a foil-covered coffee cake. Tessa leaned against the railing with her phone in her hand. Reverend Paul Whitcomb had gone quiet under his straw hat, and Rosalind Keene, my neighbor, watched from the bottom step with the calm expression of a woman who had seen plenty of people confuse confidence with rights. Marcus Bell, the mover, looked from them to me. "Ma'am," he asked, "are we unloading?" I glanced through the doorway at the blue folder waiting on my kitchen table. "Not yet," I said. Those two words, "not yet," did not come from courage as much as they came from a kind of exhaustion that had finally learned to stand upright. To understand why I did not step aside and let my family carry their boxes through my door, you have to understand that I had been answering emergencies long before I ever put on a county headset. At work, people called because their world had narrowed to one terrible moment. A fire in the kitchen, a child who had fallen, a stranger outside the window, an older husband who would not answer when his wife shook his shoulder. My job was to become the steady voice people could borrow until help reached them. I asked for the address. I asked what they could see. I told them when to breathe, when to move, when to stay exactly where they were. After enough years, calm stopped feeling like something I did, and started feeling like something everyone expected me to be. Then I went home and did the same job for free. When Owen lost his insurance job the first time, I sent him $400 and called it temporary, even though we both knew temporary had a way of stretching in our family. When my father received a notice from the bank that made him nervous, he forwarded it to me with one sentence. "Can you look at this?" When my mother got offended because Claudia left her out of a birthday lunch, I was the one who called both women and turned sharp feelings into polite words before Thanksgiving could be ruined. Nobody asked if I was tired. They said, "Evelyn knows what to do." That sounds like respect, until you realize it can become a cage. Once people decide you are capable, some of them stop noticing the cost. They hand you their panic, their bills, their guilt, their bad choices, and they expect you to store all of it somewhere inside yourself without ever running out of room. The memory that stayed with me was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning in February, after a 12-hour overnight shift. I had just finished taking over from a trainee who froze during a multi-car crash call. By the time I reached my car, the sun was pale over the employee lot, and my hands still smelled like break room coffee. My phone showed 12 missed calls from my mother. No message asking if I was awake. No question about whether I had worked all night. Just one text. "Owen needs you." I sat behind the wheel and watched those 3 words fade when the screen dimmed. For the first time in my life, I did not call back right away. I did not know it then, but that was the first crack in the version of me they thought would always answer. That crack widened slowly, not all at once. People like to imagine a boundary arrives like a slammed door, but mine came more quietly, like daylight showing under one. At first, it was small. I stopped answering my phone during dinner. I let one of my father's bank notices sit in his inbox until morning. I told Owen I could not send him money that week, then sat on the edge of my bathtub afterward, waiting for the guilt to swallow me. It did not. It made noise for a while, then it got tired. By the time I left the dispatcher's office for good, I was not broken in any dramatic way. I was functional, which can be more dangerous because people mistake functional for fine. I took a consulting contract helping smaller counties review emergency call procedures. The hours were steadier, the pay was lower, but it was enough. More importantly, when I closed my laptop at the end of the day, I did not feel like the whole world still had a hand on my shoulder. That was when I found the bungalow. It had been built in 1946 and looked as if every storm that crossed Matthews County had leaned against it for a minute before moving on. The siding was pale blue, faded unevenly by salt and sun. One porch rail wobbled if you touched it too hard. The shed behind the house tilted slightly to the left, stubborn and tired at the same time. Inside, the kitchen cabinets were painted ivory, and the old vinyl floor had a scratch near the stove shaped almost like a river. The realtor apologized for all of it. I loved all of it. The office was what sold me. It was hardly bigger than a walk-in closet, with one window facing the bay through a break in the trees. The first time I stood there, I imagined a desk, a lamp, and a cup of coffee I could finish while it was still warm. I imagined ending a workday and still having some part of myself left. The house cost $312,000. I put down 74,000, every dollar saved from overtime, holiday shifts, and vacations I was too tired to take. The mortgage scared me. The inspection report was longer than I wanted. The roof would need work someday. None of that changed what I felt at closing when Priya Nandakumar slid the deed across the table and said, "Sole owner." 2 words. Not daughter, not backup plan, not emergency contact. Owner. The afternoon I got the keys, I changed the locks before moving in a single box. I thought I was being practical. I did not know yet how much that small act would matter. What I did not understand then was that changing the locks only protected the doors. It did nothing about the story my mother was already building back in Henrico. While I was signing mortgage papers, choosing where the bookshelves would go, and learning the sounds of an old house settling after dark, Marla Porter was telling people I had finally become the daughter she believed I owed her. She started with Claudia, because my aunt had a soft heart and a louder mouth than she realized. My mother told her I had asked my parents to move down near the bay so I could keep an eye on them. Then she told 2 women from church that the bungalow was too much house for one single woman, and that God had a way of putting families back where they belonged. By the time Reverend Paul heard it, the story had grown a halo. Evelyn had stepped up. Evelyn had opened her home. Evelyn had finally understood what family meant. No one called me to check. That was the part that hurt later, when I finally saw it all laid out. Not only that my mother had lied, but that the lie sounded so much like the version of me everyone already preferred that nobody questioned it. Of course Evelyn would do that. Of course Evelyn would make room. Of course Evelyn would rearrange her life before anyone had to ask. For nearly 4 weeks, while I was measuring curtains, changing mailing addresses, and arguing with a plumber about a dripping shutoff valve, my mother was moving into my house in other people's minds. She talked about where she would put her sewing machine. She told Claudia that Dad needed morning light because his knees were getting worse. She told Owen the office could become a temporary bedroom. Temporary, in my family, had always been a word with no expiration date. I found out the night she called me, after I unmuted the family group chat for the first time in weeks. There were dozens of messages. Hearts. Praying hands, little cheerful comments about fresh starts, and answered prayers. Then I saw the photograph. My bungalow. The pale blue siding. The porch rail I still needed to tighten. The ivory kitchen visible through the front window. My mother had posted it 3 weeks earlier with the caption, "God is good. Our new place by the bay. Our new place." I sat at the kitchen table and felt the room tilt in a quiet, private way. Then I scrolled lower and saw Tessa's message congratulating my parents on selling their house in Henrico County. Under it was a screenshot of the listing. Stamped across the photo were 2 words that changed everything. Under contract. Under contract meant the choice had already been made before my mother ever dialed my number. It meant the truck was not a family emergency rolling toward my house. It was the final step of a plan that had been moving without me for weeks. I stared at that screenshot until the red letters blurred, then did the one thing I had been avoiding since the phone first rang. I called my father. Stanley Porter answered on the second ring, but he did not say hello. He just said my name quietly, like a man stepping into a room where something had already broken. "Dad," I said. "Is the house really under contract?" There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear cardboard scraping against cardboard, the hollow sound of a room being emptied. "The closing is set for Friday," he said. That was my father's way. Never the full answer first. Always a softer sentence placed in front of it, hoping no one would push through. But I was done letting soft words cover hard facts. "How much?" I asked. He sighed. 279,500. For a moment, that number almost made the situation sound reasonable. Then I asked what would be left after the loan. Silence. That silence told me more than the number had. Piece by piece, the truth came out. There was a home equity loan I did not know about, $196,400. There were credit cards my mother called temporary. There were closing costs. There was money Owen had borrowed for a business idea that had never become a business. Once closing cleared and everything was paid, my parents would not be walking away with a nest egg. They would be walking away with about $38,700 and a truck full of furniture. Mom wants to keep that money, I said. She thinks it's safer, he answered. Safer than rent? He did not respond. That was when I understood the real plan. They were not coming to me because they had no options. They were coming because my mother had decided my home could become the missing line in their budget. If they moved in with me for free, that remaining money could stay untouched. Owen could be helped again. My father could avoid looking at the damage. My mother could call the whole thing family. Dad, I asked, did you ever hear me say yes? The sound on the line changed. Not a gasp, not a confession, just his breathing getting smaller. Your mother said you two had talked. We didn't. Another pause. Then he said, so quietly, I almost missed it. Oh, one word. Small, ashamed, and far too late. That "oh" should have made me feel powerful. It did not. It made me feel tired in a place deeper than anger. My father had finally understood, but understanding was not the same as standing up. He had spent years letting my mother drive the car, and then acting surprised when he did not like where they ended up. Now they were packed, under contract, and pointed toward my front door. After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen with my phone in my hand and looked toward the second bedroom. It was empty, except for 2 boxes of winter clothes and a lamp I had not found a place for yet. A reasonable person, or at least the version of me my family preferred, would have seen that room and called it a solution. My parents were aging. My father was ashamed. My mother was difficult, yes, but she was still my mother. The house had 2 bedrooms. I was only one person. That was how the old voice started. Just for a few months, just until they find a place. Just until Owen gets settled. Just until everyone calms down. I opened a text to my mother. My thumbs moved before the rest of me had agreed. Okay. We need to talk about rules. But okay. I stared at it. 8 words, and every one of them felt like a door unlocking. I could almost hear what would happen next. Marla would arrive wounded but victorious. Owen would carry in boxes before the first rule was spoken. My father would thank me softly, and then disappear into his shame. The office facing the bay would become someone's storage room. The kitchen would fill with my mother's opinions. The silence I had bought with 14 years of work would be gone by dinner. And everyone would call it kindness. But it would not be kindness. It would be surrender dressed up in nicer clothes. It would teach my mother that if she lied loudly enough, I would eventually make her lie true. It would teach Owen that my boundaries were temporary. It would teach my father that his helplessness still worked. Most of all, it would teach me that the first home I had ever owned was still not enough to make me choose myself. So I deleted the message slowly. Rules. Talk. Need. Okay. Word by word. The old daughter disappeared from the screen. When the box was empty, I set the phone down and pressed both palms flat against the counter. My hands were still shaking, but something inside me was not. Then I said, out loud to the empty kitchen, not this time. After that, I opened the closing folder and found Priya Nandakumar's card. Priya answered her office line at 8:37 the next morning, before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. That was one of the reasons I had liked her at closing. She sounded awake before the rest of the world had decided what kind of day it was going to be. Evelyn, she said. What happened? I almost laughed, because good lawyers and good dispatchers have that in common. They hear the problem before you finish naming it. I kept my voice factual. I told her my parents were bringing a moving truck to my property before noon. I told her they believed they had permission to move in. I told her I had never given that permission, not in writing, not by text, not by email, not in a phone call. I told her my mother had been telling relatives a different story, and that I needed to know exactly where I stood before the truck reached my driveway. Priya was quiet for a moment, but not in a worried way. In a reading way. I could hear paper moving on her desk. The deed is in your name only, she said. No co-owner, no life estate, no recorded lease, No occupancy agreement, no transfer document. Hearing it out loud did something to me. I had read those words myself, but fear has a way of making facts feel like opinions until someone trained in the law repeats them back. So they can't just move in, I said. No, Priya answered. They can arrive. They can ask. You can say no. Those are very different things. Then she said the sentence I would carry with me all morning. A family story is not a property right. She emailed me a short letter on her firm's letterhead within 20 minutes. It listed my name, the parcel number, the recording date, and confirmed that I was the sole legal owner of the bungalow. No one else held any claim to occupy, possess, or control the property without my written consent. I printed 2 copies. Then I built my timeline on a yellow legal pad. My closing date. The date my mother first posted the house in the group chat. The date my parents' listing went under contract. The time of her phone call. The truck's expected arrival. Underneath all of it, I wrote one line in capital letters. No consent given. After that, I checked the doors. Front, back, side entrance off the kitchen. All rekeyed. All solid. 3 keys existed, and every one of them was in my possession. For the first time since the phone rang, I was not hoping my mother would understand. I was preparing for the moment she could not pretend she misunderstood. Once I stopped hoping for understanding, the morning became strangely simple. Not easy. Simple. My mother had spent weeks building a room where everyone already believed her before I ever walked in. So I decided I would not argue with her in private, where she could hang up, cry to someone else, and turn my boundary into cruelty before lunch. If she had used witnesses to give her lie weight, then witnesses were exactly what the truth needed. I called Claudia first. She answered with warmth already in her voice, the kind people use when they think they are part of good news. Sweetheart, are you excited? I looked at the legal pad on my table, at the line that said no consent given, and kept my voice steady. I know Mom told everyone they're coming down today, I said. Since you've been part of the conversation, I'd like you to come by for coffee before they arrive. There was a pleased little pause. Oh, honey, of course. I can bring something. Bring whatever you like, I said. Just be here before noon. Then I called Tessa. I did not explain everything. I only told her there were some dates I wanted another set of eyes on, and she heard enough in my voice not to ask for gossip. I'll come, she said, and I'll bring my phone. Reverend Paul was harder. Not because he was unkind, but because my mother had already wrapped the whole thing in church language. Blessing, duty, family. I told him carefully that there had been confusion about my home, and that I wanted the people who had heard my mother's version to hear mine in the same room. He was quiet for a moment, then said, I think I should be there. Rosalind saw me on the porch while I was ending that call. She was watering a pot of geraniums next door, wearing a sun hat, and the expression of a woman who missed nothing. I told her there might be a moving truck, and some raised voices. She nodded once. People confuse confidence with permission all the time, she said. Don't let them. The last call was to Marcus Bell, the mover. His number was on the truck company's confirmation text Owen had stupidly forwarded to the group chat. I asked one question. Would he unload without the homeowner's approval? No, ma'am, he said. Not if there's a dispute. By 11:30, the coffee was made. Claudia's mugs were set out. The blue folder sat on the table. Beside it, I placed one more packet. Welcome packet for prospective tenants. If my parents wanted my house, they would not enter it as owners. They would apply like everyone else. Claudia arrived at 11:38 with a coffee cake wrapped in foil and a nervous brightness she was trying to pass off as excitement. Tessa came 2 minutes behind her, sunglasses pushed up on her head, phone already in her hand. Reverend Paul parked by the mailbox and walked up the gravel path slowly, looking less like a man coming to celebrate, and more like one who had realized halfway there that he might be walking into a confession. I opened the door and let them in. The house looked peaceful on purpose. Coffee on the counter, mugs beside it. A plate of sliced peaches Tessa had brought without asking. The bay light came through the office window and laid a pale square across the floor. I wanted them to see that before they saw anything else. Not a battlefield, not a daughter waiting to explode. A home, my home. Claudia touched the porch rail and smiled. "Oh, Evelyn, it's sweet as can be." "It is," I said. She looked toward the second bedroom. "Your mother said your father would love the morning light." Tessa's eyes moved to me, quick and sharp. Reverend Paul lowered his coffee without drinking it. I only said, "Let's wait until everyone gets here." At 11:55, the sound came down the lane, a heavy engine, gravel crunching, brakes sighing under weight. The white moving truck appeared first, too large for the driveway, followed by my father's sedan. For one strange second, nobody moved. Then my mother stepped out. Marla Porter had dressed for victory. Cream blouse, pressed navy pants, pearl earrings, hair sprayed smooth against the bay wind. She looked at the bungalow, at the porch, at the water beyond the trees, and gave one small nod, as if the world had delivered what she ordered. My father got out more slowly. He saw Reverend Paul first, then Claudia, then me. His face changed before he could hide it. Owen jumped from the passenger side and went straight to the truck's rear door. "Where do you want the big stuff?" he called. My mother climbed the steps, smiling. "Well," she said, opening her arms to Claudia, "we made it." Then she walked inside and began giving away my house. "The back room will be better for Ray," she said. "More light. Owen can use the office until he gets settled. Evelyn barely needs it now that she works from home. And these cabinets," she brushed her fingers over the ivory paint, "we'll warm them up, maybe sage." No one laughed. No one agreed. The quiet spread slowly, but my mother did not notice it yet. She was too busy performing ownership. Finally, Owen shouted from outside, "Mom, should Marcus start unloading?" I set my mug down. "Before one box comes in," I said, "we need to clear up what everyone thinks I agreed to." My mother's smile held for half a second too long. "Evelyn," she said, in the warning voice I had known since childhood, "this is not the time." "It became the time when the truck pulled in," I said, "and when you told everyone I had invited you." Claudia looked from my mother to me. Tessa's thumb moved over her phone. Reverend Paul stood very still near the counter, his hat held in both hands. Marla gave a short laugh. "Don't be dramatic. We discussed this." "When?" I asked. Her eyes sharpened. "You know when." "No," I said. "I don't." "Was it by text? Email? Phone call? Did I write it down anywhere? Did I say the words, 'You can live in my house for free'?" The room went quiet enough that I could hear Owen drop something outside against the truck bed. My mother's face changed. "Not much. Just enough. Families don't need contracts for everything." "For dinner, no," I said. "For property, yes." I opened the blue folder. First, I laid out the deed. I turned it toward Claudia and Tessa, not toward my mother, because my mother had never respected a fact that came from me alone. "This is the deed recorded with the county. One owner, Evelyn Porter." Then I placed Priya's letter beside it. "This is from the attorney who handled my closing. It confirms no one else has any legal claim to occupy, possess, or control this house without my written consent." Marla's cheeks flushed. "You called a lawyer on your own parents?" "No," I said. "I called the lawyer for the house I own." Tessa stepped closer, reading the dates. "Aunt Marla," she said carefully, "your listing went under contract before Evelyn even moved in." My mother turned on her. "That is not your business." Reverend Paul's voice was gentle, but it carried. "Marla, did Evelyn ever tell you directly that she agreed to this?" For the first time that morning, my mother had no sentence ready. Owen came to the doorway, red-faced and impatient. Behind him, Marcus waited with his clipboard. "We unloading or not?" "No," I said. Marcus nodded once and closed the truck's rear latch. That sound landed harder than a slammed door. My mother's eyes filled, but the tears came angry. "So what are we supposed to do now? Sleep in the street? After everything we did for you?" I slid the second packet across the table. "If you want to apply as tenants, The rent is $19.50 a month, 2 months deposit, background check, 6-month lease. Owen is not included. Nothing moves in without my written approval. She stared at the packet, like I had handed her something obscene. And if we don't like it, she whispered. I kept my voice even. Then you can find somewhere else. For a moment, no one moved. My mother looked around the room for the old arrangement of the world, the one where she spoke, and everyone else softened around her. But Claudia was staring at the deed. Tessa was looking at the screenshot on her phone. Reverend Paul had lowered his eyes, not in judgment, but in sorrow. Even my father stayed seated on the porch step, his hands hanging between his knees, as if standing up would require choosing a side. Marcus drove the truck back out without unloading a single box. Owen complained the whole time, loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but not loud enough to change anything. My mother did not speak to me again before she left. She only gathered her purse, walked past the tenant packet as if it were poison, and said to my father, "Get in the car." I watched them go from the porch I had paid for, with keys in my pocket and no apology in my mouth. That afternoon, Claudia stayed after everyone else left. She sat beside me with the coffee cake untouched between us and cried into a paper napkin. "She told me you offered," she kept saying. "I should have asked you." I told her the truth. "Yes, you should have. Not cruelly. Just honestly." That was new for me. Within 3 weeks, my parents rented a 2-bedroom apartment outside Richmond. It was modest, practical, and exactly the kind of place they could have chosen before trying to turn my life into their solution. Owen found a job selling replacement windows, not because he suddenly became responsible, but because nobody had a spare room left for him to wait in. The family group chat went silent for a while. Then, slowly, it changed. People asked questions before congratulating each other on stories they had not verified. I did not cut my parents off completely. That would make a cleaner ending. But real life is rarely clean. A week later, I emailed my father a list of senior housing resources, financial counseling offices, and rental assistance programs in their county. Help I chose, help with edges. No key, no bedroom, no office by the bay. Months later, I still sit on that pale blue porch in the evenings. The rail still needs tightening. The shed still leans. The mortgage still scares me some mornings. But when I turn the lock at night, the sound does not feel hard anymore. It feels honest. A home is not something people earn by needing it louder than you do. It is something you build, protect, and open only to those who know the difference between being welcomed and taking over. The lesson Evelyn learned was not that family does not matter. It was that family matters too much to be built on lies, pressure, and silent surrender. For years, she believed love meant making room, even when no one asked what it cost her. She believed being the strong one meant never needing rest, never saying no, never letting anyone feel the consequences of their own choices. But strength is not the same as being available for every emergency. Kindness is not the same as handing over your peace. And a good heart does not have to become an open door. Sometimes, the hardest boundary is not the one you set against a stranger. It is the one you set with the people who raised you. The people who know exactly which words will make you feel guilty, small, selfish, or cruel. They know your history. They know your soft places. And if they are used to taking from you, your first no will feel like betrayal to them, even when it is really the first honest thing you have ever said. Evelyn did not win because she hated her parents. She won because she finally stopped confusing love with rescue. She still cared. She still helped in the way she could. But she stopped letting other people turn her life into their escape plan. That is a lesson many people learn late. You can love someone and still not give them your house. You can feel sorry for someone and still not make their bad decision your burden. You can be a daughter, a son, a sibling, a parent, or a friend, without giving up the one place where your soul is allowed to breathe. A real family does not demand access by force. A real family asks. A real family respects the answer. So if this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to set a boundary with someone who thought your kindness belonged to them? I would love to hear your thoughts, your city, and where you are watching from. And if this story meant something to you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to remember that peace is not selfish. Sometimes peace is the home you finally stop giving away.